Can I ask you, just to follow up, what people in South Korea made of Mike Pence's visit? You know, he didn't stand when the Korean team came in, you know, seemed a little offish. Was that received badly or well?
You know, I mean, I think the news that I'm reading coming out of South Korea in terms of that incident is mixed. You know, as with many things, South Korea is a vibrant democracy. There's, you know, a variety of opinions on just about everything. But your question is an important one because Vice President Pence obviously came in as the representative of the United States.
And a guest.
And the fact, and the fact that he did not stand at that moment, you know, in the opening ceremony, I think were noted by many. And I think it, you know, does raise questions about, you know, United States you know, full support, you know, as the two Koreas tried to take full advantage of the momentum and the positive vibe that is unfolded throughout the Olympics. So it's, again, a very tough situation for South Korean leaders and the people because they don't want to be too far ahead of the United States, but they also, you know, understand that this may be their best opportunity for talks and the resumption of talks.
So they're Koreans, you know, they can talk to Koreans.
Right,
you know,
exactly.
It's very interesting, this dynamic.
Without the permission of a foreign power. I mean, that's, the New York Times, the Washington Post is saying North Korea is trying to drive a wedge between the South Koreans and America. South Korea can determine its own destiny. It should be allowed to determine its own destiny and pursue its own path.
Interesting point. Qinduo Xu, I want to bring you in here because just before the fireworks of the closing ceremony, we had some fireworks here in Washington with the latest round of sanctions on Friday, which followed up on UN sanctions, but really targeting shipping in the area for potentially ship-to-ship transfers of illicit oil shipments and coal imports and the like. China criticized this, and they've done this before, where the US takes UN sanctions and then imposes on top of those its own sanctions as well. Do you think that was helpful? Do you think it's part of this dual program of maximum pressure while also trying to bring the DPRK to the table and discuss denuclearization?
Well, obviously, I think for the Chinese side, you know, like UN sanctions, which are already very tightened, are necessary. You know, that's also based on the consensus of the related parties in terms of, you know, related to the Korean issue here. And for the Chinese side, it's also seeing a window of opportunities, and there's atmosphere created by the two Koreas. At least it brings a temporary sense of relief. You know, there's people are not talking about the war, no escalation of military strike. So some, from here, we might reach somewhere substantive. We can bring some real peace and stability to this region. Because China shares the goal with South Korea and also the means to achieve peace and stability, probably. On one hand, they would try their best to prevent any military strike from the United States, not to mention war. On the other hand, they would push North Korean side as hard as possible to start dialogue with the U.S. and reduce their nuclear weapons over there. So we can probably move toward a real dialogue between the two sides.
Yeah, I mean, obviously China's six-party talks sort of laid that roadmap out where in return for denuclearization, there would be security guarantees and then bringing the DPRK back into the family of nations. But I want to ask Karl here, we've moved on from those days and it now looks like the DPRK is essentially a nuclear state and would want a recognition for that. Do you think there's any movement possible on that at all?
At the current moment, no. It's going to take a major rethink on the part of the United States and its kind of standard security practices and thought for them to come out and now recognize North Korea as a nuclear power. Of course, North Korea looks at several examples. Number one, it looks at Iraq, it looks at Libya, what has happened there as reasons to not give up its weapons. It also looks at India and Pakistan and the sanctions that they were put under when they decided to develop nuclear weapons, and India and Pakistan did that outside of the NPT as well. Those sanctions, frankly, had very little bite, and on North Korea there is more bite, and it looks like they are starting to work. And so now North Korea is perhaps going to try to come back to the table. It's looking probably for an easing of sanctions and perhaps aid packages, even though just recently the ROK Moon has come out and said that any foreign aid is not to be accepted from imperialist countries, obviously citing the United States. But we know that if an aid package is offered, North Korea will likely accept it and push for it. But in terms of getting to denuclearization, we know that North Korea is not going to talk about that. And for the moment, the United States has no intention of recognizing North Korea as a nuclear weapons power because it fears perhaps a domino effect of other states that may then go for nuclear breakout, Iran being the obvious example. So for the time moment, we're really at an impasse. And I don't really see any way to break it unless somehow Moon Jae-in can thread the needle, which is a very difficult needle to thread, that can get North Korea and the United States together at the table. And for this, South Korea has a very important role to play, but I think one that will ultimately prove to be too difficult in managing what can be very difficult partners.
Brian, before I get to you, on Friday, as the Olympics are coming to an end, President Trump gave some remarks about the DPRK. He talked about these new sanctions just unveiled, but also talked about this ominous phase 2 if they don't work. Let's take a listen.
If the sanctions don't work, we'll have to go phase 2. And phase 2 may be a very rough thing, may be very, very unfortunate for the world. But hopefully the sanctions will work. We have tremendous support all around the world for what we're doing. It really is a rogue nation. If we can make a deal, it'll be a great thing. And if we can't, something will have to happen.
You're standing next to Malcolm Turnbull there, the Prime Minister of Australia, who kept a very straight face during that. I mean, what does that mean? That means
glib.
Does it mean this bloody nose that you were talking about is still on the table?
Yeah, let's also remember the bloody nose is actually millions of people dying.
Right, so
like
it's not just a bloody nose.
This kind of euphemistic language, whereas Lindsey said, well, it's okay, all the dying will be over there. It'll be Koreans, it'll be Asians, it'll be over there.
Well, there are about 200,000 Americans there too, right?
But even still, for Lindsey Graham, he's making the point, let's get it over with. And there is a current within the Washington establishment that thinks war is basically inevitable with Korea. Better to start it now and get it over with now before North Korea gets stronger. We have also the new sanctions, which I just want to mention. By sanctioning all those other companies, including Chinese companies, Taiwanese companies, other shipping companies.
Yeah, from all over the place.
All over the place. We're setting the stage
Singapore,
for Americans using the sanctions to interdict on the high seas vessels that would be going to or from North Korea.
Is this an oil embargo by another name because they couldn't get that through the United Nations, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. And I think what they're doing is also setting the stage for necessarily an incident to happen, and the incident will be a spark, and the spark will grow into a prairie fire. We could see something very large. Washington is trying to use the sanctions. When we talk about sanctions, we think of them in a kind of cold way, pundit talk. We're talking about the attempt to create famine in North Korea. I mean, this is a cruel, barbaric system. It's not an alternative to war. It's not perceived as an alternative to war by North Korea, nor should it be. Iraq, again, being a primary example. Sanctions are a part of war. Blockading a country and depriving its people of food and medicine is war. So we need to go in a different route. Will the North Koreans reciprocate? Yes. What does North Korea want? That's what we have to come back to. They don't want a war with the U.S. That's suicide. They want a security guarantee that can only come from Washington. It can't come from Beijing. It can't come from Moscow. It certainly can't come from Seoul. It can only come from Washington. So they will reciprocate if there's movement in that direction.
Jessica, can you follow up a little bit
Absolutely. I'd love to, yes.
Yeah.
I think those are excellent points, and I just want to add that this year is the 15th year since the Iraq War began. And I think that's worth talking about in this context of a preventive war, because I think Americans who paid the ultimate sacrifice in Iraq, as well as, we had now $1 trillion in the national debt.
Not to mention the hundreds of thousands of Iraqis.
Absolutely.
Well. Yeah.
I was just going to get to that, exactly. So the cost of war, it just goes on and on and on, and our nation is still reeling from that. And so I think, as we talk about a potential brief war, as Senator Jim Reich said at the Munich Security Conference, nobody who advocates for that approach tells you what it's going to be like the day after. What happens the day after you launch such a strike?
Well, who said no war plan survives the first shot?
Right.
Well, there we go.
And so, so I think we're talking about something extremely catastrophic and something that we need to be really clear-eyed about. There's no sugarcoating war. And you can ask any veteran, anyone who serves in the military, serves in the Veterans Affairs Department, Defense Department, et cetera,
Yeah.
about the sheer human cost of war. And so we should not overlook that when we talk about North Korea.
That's a very interesting point because there have been some sort of talks about some sort of contingency planning if a war broke out between the US and China. China has sort of pushed back on that because they don't want to be seen to be giving any tacit approval to any US plans, and also that would rile up Pyongyang. But Qinduo Xu, war, what would it look like? Because the Chinese point of view seems to be that a bloody nose would not work and just lead to more destabilization. And a lot of American strategists said, actually, what you have to do is just go in and decapitate and do everything. Otherwise, the risk is even worse. So there are no good options here, right?
No, no good options. For the Chinese side, at least the official view is like, negotiation dialogue is the only way forward. Because let's not forget, it's easy to start a war. It's very difficult to end the war. And also, there's a lot of unknown about North Korea. I'm not sure, U.S. intelligence is capable of getting all the necessary information to prepare for a preemptive strike against or the war in Iraq or in other places. And also remember, North Korea, they do have some weapons close to let's say nuclear weapons maybe. If there's a retaliation, we could be talking about hundreds of thousands of people. Their life will be at the stake. So this is a horrifying consequence if there's a military strike, if there's retaliation or a war break out between the U.S. and North Korea. And also remember, there would be a strong opposition from South Korean side because basically they will be the major main victims of any military strike.
Karl Friedhoff, this bloody nose and other scenarios, obviously the US is thinking about this or at least using it as a pressure tactic. But there was some point raised by Jessica here that they went into Iraq with better intelligence. I mean, DPRK is a black hole. The room here for miscalculation is so high, isn't it? Do you think that will pull them back from the brink?
I think that it will. It looks like they're now trying to posture. They're trying to pose a credible military threat and hopefully bringing North Korea to the negotiating table. To the point earlier, we talk about North Korean arms along the DMZ. I think it's helpful to put numbers along with that rather than just saying some arms there. They have about 8,000 artillery pieces and missile launchers, or rocket launchers, excuse me, posted there, almost all within range. They could, within the first hour of a retaliation, estimates are that they could put about 300,000 conventional rounds into Seoul if they chose to do so. And let's not forget that if there were to be retaliation, it's not only Seoul that would be the primary target. Tokyo would probably also come under target as well, and that would likely double at least the casualties that would be seen in Seoul. So any kind of military strike, a bloody nose strike, would be frightening. The toll would be incredibly high. So there is hope that this is kind of a posture from the United States. But of course, with the president that we have, no one is quite sure what is going to happen here. The administration seems intent on trying to really do this and ensuring that North Korea takes this seriously, that China takes it seriously. And I think China here is one of the X factors because there is an assumption that China is going to intervene perhaps on the side of North Korea, but that may not be the case. If China feels threatened, they may try to move in. Let's keep in mind that most of the nuclear facilities are much closer to China than they are to South Korea, and China may move in an attempt to take over those nuclear sites, those of which we know. That may in turn see fighting break out between the North Koreans and the Chinese. And this is another complicating factor. Yeah,
a nightmare scenario. Jessica, I just want you to have the last word about what do you think this did for the Korean Peninsula, this whole Olympics. The fact that we saw cheerleaders from the DPRK, different K-pop bands, all sort of coming together in this quite interesting cultural exchange.
Absolutely. I mean, it's I was stunned personally as a Korean American who was born in South Korea to see the athletes from the two countries march as one during the opening ceremony, and I think this leaves a lot of room for hope. And that's not something that I say lightly. This is a very dark, serious subject that we're debating here, but absolutely, I think the Olympics have really brought us something special and unknown, and I'd like to see where this goes.
I'm going to have to end it there. Hope, and may the Olympic spirit live on when it comes to negotiations between the two Koreas. Thanks so much all our guests here in Washington, D.C., and also in China and beyond. Thanks so much. That's it for this edition of The Heat.